Hi, Stuart, and welcome to our next math virtual learning lesson. Make sure that you're ready to learn, find a quiet place to do your work, have out a pencil in your math notebook, and message your teacher if you need any help. All right, we are still working in Chapter 11. Today's objective: I will be able to represent and interpret data using a line plot. So we're taking a break from converting in the customary system, and we're just going to do a lesson today on line plots. Maybe you've heard of them before. Here's what a line plot looks like. A line plot shows data on a number line with an X to show how many times the number comes up. So line plots are number lines. So you can see that this number line is counting by ones. 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. All line plots have labels to tell you what data is being counted. So the label for our number line is the number of hours watching TV. So all of these numbers on the number line represent a number of hours. For example, this 5 means 5 hours spent watching TV. 2 means 2 hours watching TV. What about all these X's? Each X represents one time. They show how many of each. So let's pretend that I did a survey and I asked my students, how many hours did you watch TV? This X right here might be you. Maybe you watch 2 hours of TV. If you watch 2 hours of TV, then your X would go right here. Let's say I ask your friend the same question, and they watch 2 hours of TV. I stack their X on top of your X. And if a third student watches 2 hours of TV, I put their X on top. I ask another student, how many hours of TV do you watch? They say 3 hours, so I put their X on the 3. And that's what all of these X's represent. If I look at 4 hours, I notice there are no X's on top of the 4, which means none of the people that I asked watch 4 hours of TV. Nobody watches 1 hour of TV, and thankfully, no one watches 9 hours of TV. So if there are no X's on top of your number and the number line, that means that wasn't a response. A lot of times you will see the 2 numbers on the end of the number line with no X's. And when I make my number line, sometimes I put in those numbers on the ends just to make the line plot look a little nicer. You don't have to do that. We could have cut this line plot off at 8 and 2. However, you must include this 4 because remember I said this is a number line. We can't just jump around however we want. We can skip count in a pattern, or we can count by ones, or we can count by fractional amounts, but it has to be equal amounts. So let's take a look at an example. This is from your My Math book. 6 friends shared several foot-long submarine sandwiches. In this part of the United States, we call them hoagies. The table shows the amount each friend ate. Make a line plot of the lengths in the table. So before I do any work, I want to look at my table. These fractions represent the sandwich lengths in feet. So because they're all fractional amounts, none of them are a foot. They're all less than a foot. This sandwich was 1/3 of a foot. This one's 1/3 of a foot, 1/3 of a foot, 1/2 of a foot, 1/4 of a foot, and 1/4 of a foot. So we have to make a line plot of these lengths. So let's count the number of times that each fraction appears in the table. How many times do you see 1/4 of a foot? Yep, I got 2. How many times do you see 1/3 of a foot? I see 3. How many times do you see 1/2 of a foot? I got 1. Now, what I like to do is say, okay, they told me there were 6 numbers because there are 6 friends. 2 plus 3 plus 1 equals 6. That way I don't leave anything out. All right. To make my line plot, I'm going to place the correct number of x's above each fraction on my number line. So here's my number line, and you might think, wait a minute, Mrs. Grab, I thought you said it had to be equal amounts, correct skip counting, all of that. Well, it is. We just didn't label every fractional amount. The book labeled the 0 and the 1 and half as the benchmark, and we need half anyway. And then the other 2 fractions where they would appear on this number line. So they didn't just place them wherever they wanted. The book had a purpose in placing 1/4 and then 1/3. And that's because 1/4 is less than 1/3. And 1/3 is less than 1/2. So we could fill in the rest of these if we wanted, but we don't need to. So what we need to do is go back to our table, or we can look right here. One of the friends had a sandwich that was 1/4 of a foot. I'm sorry, 2 of the friends had a sandwich that was 1/4 of a foot. So we need to go to 1/4 of a foot, and we need to put 2 x's above that. Now we need to go to 1/3 of a foot, and we need 3 x's above it. And then one friend had a 1/2 foot sandwich, hoagie, so we place 1 x above the 1/2. And we need to add a title to your line plot. And mine's not showing up. Well, that's stinky. Let's see if I can type it in real quick. My title should match my table's title, sandwich lengths in feet. And I know we're used to putting a title at the top, but on a line plot, I like to put it underneath. That way it reminds me of what these fractions are for down here. So sandwich lengths, and then I'm putting my unit so I know it's measured in feet and not something like inches or whatever else. All right, so here is our title, sandwich lengths in feet. Do these X's represent the length of the sandwich? No, they represent the number of times that length happened. So the X's represent the number of times. The numbers on our number line represent the actual length. And that can be pretty tricky for a lot of students. All right, so what do we do with this information? We can find something called the fair share, or the amount each friend would receive if the sandwiches were divided equally. So let's say they have a total amount of sandwiches and they want to split them equally. That way, someone doesn't get more, someone doesn't get less. We can call that a fair share. Another word for fair share, and a word that we use a lot more often in real life, and you've probably heard this word, is average. So how do we find the fair share or the average? First, we add the measurements to find the whole. Then we divide that whole by the number of measurements. Okay, you're going to do this more in 6th grade when you work with data. When you find the average, or another word for it is the mean. You add your data and divide by how many you added together. So let's do that. Find the fair share from our line plot. So if we're adding data, we're saying, okay, let's add whatever this x is equal. This x is equal to 1/4. Well, then we have to add this x, which is another 1/4. So 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/3 plus 1/2. That's how we would find the total. We could also find it by looking in the table and adding those together. Now that might seem like a lot. Oh my gosh, I'm adding all of these fractions together. But you might be able to use some mental math. For example, if we look at our 2/4, 1/4 and 1/4 is 2/4, which is a half. If I look at my thirds, I have 3 of the 1/3, which is 3/3 or a whole. And then I have 1 of the 1/2. So I have my 1 whole plus my half from the fourths and my half that was just by itself. So 1 plus a half is 2 wholes. So that sandwich, if we lined all of those pieces together, so if the 6 friends took their sandwiches and they put them in a big line, it would equal 2 whole feet. Now let's say, okay, they wanted to split those 2 feet equally. Now we have to divide by how many pieces there were. So if we take our 2 feet, I forget where I put it, there we go. If we take our 2 total feet and we divide it by how many x's, the number of x's, okay, the number of friends, we get 2 divided by 6. Well, that isn't a fact family. But remember from a previous chapter that fractions and division are the same thing. So I can write division as a fraction. So 2 divided by 6 is 2/6. And then I can simplify it. 2 and 6 can both be divided by 2, which gives me a third. So if we found the fair share, if the 2 feet of sandwiches was split up between those 6 people equally, they would each get a third of a foot. All right, let's take a look at another example. We're going to make a line plot of the measurements and then find the fair share. So now we're looking at the amount of juice measured in gallons. They didn't give us a story to go with this, so it can be maybe the amount of juice that a family drank every day or whatever. But we do know it's measured in gallons. So let's make a line plot first. I've started with the basics, just a blank number line. Then what I want to do is get my units on the number line. So what I've done is I always like to do 0 and 1 as my end amounts if I have just fractions. And then if I look at my fractions, I have a fourth and a half. That's it. So what I've done is I cut down the middle for a half, and then I cut this entire number line that we can see into 4 equal parts. And I've labeled them a fourth, 2/4, which is a half, 3/4, and a whole. Now remember, 3/4 is not part of my data, but I can still put it there just so it makes more sense to me. You don't have to put it there though. But what you do need to do is make sure that this is to scale. Okay, you would not have a fourth down here. You would not have a fourth really, really close to a half. So you have to be careful, and that's the tricky part. I've also given a title to my line plot, and I've used the same title for my table, amount of juice in gallons. That's what these fractions represent. So now let's make our line plot. All right, I have a fourth. So I'm going to put an X over a fourth. I have another fourth right here. So I need to put an X on that again. And then I have a third one. And then I have a half. Oops. And then I have another half. And then, let's drag that down a little bit. Then I have another half. So they're tied right now. And then I have a fourth again. And lastly, I have a half. So I always like to count to make sure that I have all of my data represented. So I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 pieces of data, and I can see I have 8 X's. So I know I didn't leave anything out. Well, we can see that they're actually the same height. So that means that 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4, this person or those people had a 1/4 gallon of juice, and 4 times they had a 1/2 gallon of juice. So let's find the fair share. Now this is going to look pretty complicated. I wrote it out because it was a lot to type and it was kind of a pain to type all the fractions. So I wrote it out, pardon my messy handwriting. So to find the fair share, what I've done is I've added up my fourths. I had 4 of the 1/4. So a fourth plus a fourth plus a fourth plus a fourth equals 4/4. And 4/4 equals 1 whole, so that's 1 whole gallon. So right here is a whole gallon. And then I added up my halves. Remember, I had 4 of the halves. So I have a half plus a half plus a half plus a half, which is 4 halves, and 4 divided by 2 equals 2. So that's 2 more gallons. So what's the total amount of gallons represented on our line plot? Where is it? There it is. 3 gallons. 2 gallons plus 1 equals 3 total gallons. But that's not our answer. That's not the fair share. Remember, we add and then divide. So what do we divide by? How many pieces of data there were, or how many X's. So if you go back and you look at those X's and you count them, or you count the number of data in the table, what did we get? 8. So we take our 3 total gallons of juice divided by 8 times where we had data, and we get 3 divided by 8, 3/8. So the average amount of juice is 3/8 of a gallon. Fair share, 3/8. Remember, those words are the same thing, fair share and average. Okay? All right, I want to look at one more of these with you. All right, so I made this one up. Juan was trying to play Fortnite, but kept getting interrupted. Below are the times and hours he spent playing on Sunday. Use this information to make a line plot and answer the questions. Here we go. So here's the time that Juan spent playing Fortnite in hours. Remember, he kept getting interrupted, so we have a bunch of these little pieces of time. So he spent a half hour, and then he got interrupted. And then he had another half hour, and he got interrupted. And then a third of an hour, he got interrupted, etc., etc. Okay? So that's what that data represents. Let's make our line plot. So you can see on this line plot, I have our 0 and 1 because these are all less than 1. I always like to mark my half, which is good because I actually have half as one of my data points. And then I've marked my other 2 data points, a fourth and a third. And I spaced them out where they should be. Okay? This mark, where a fourth is approximately a fourth of the way through my number line that I have. And this mark for a third is about a third of the way. So you can't just randomly place them. They have to be placed on purpose. All right, did I put a title? Oh my gosh, I was a naughty girl. All right, let me get that title on here. So, hours spent playing Fortnite. All right. So those numbers represent the hours that Juan spent playing Fortnite. So now let's make our line plot. I have a half. Actually, I'm going to give you a few seconds, and if you have your math notebook out, which you should, see if you can do this line plot. So you can pause the video, copy it down, and see if you can put the X's in the correct places on your line plot. All right, let's see how you did. So I'm going to go, I like to start at the top left and work my way over and then do the second row. So I have an X on a half. Remember, this is a half of an hour, 1/2 hour. Then I have another half. And then I have a third of an hour. And another third of an hour. And then I have a fourth of an hour. Okay, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up top, and I have 5 X's. So I know I'm doing good. Now I'm going to go here, a third of an hour. Fourth of an hour. Whoops, where am I going? A half of an hour. Another half of an hour. And another half of an hour. So I should have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 2. I should have 10 X's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm good. All right, so I have all my data represented. So I could ask you questions like, which amount of time did Juan spend playing Fortnite the most? Okay, and that would be for a half hour because it has the most number of X's. Okay? If I said, which amount of time did Juan spend playing Fortnite the least? Well, that would be for a fourth of an hour because it has the fewest number of X's. Let's look at some other questions. How many times did Juan play Fortnite? What would you do to figure that out? How many times did he play Fortnite? Well, you would count the X's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So he played Fortnite 10 times on Sunday. All right? What is the total amount of time in hours that Juan played on Sunday? What would you do to figure this out? What's this called? The total, right? We want the total amount of time. So, to find the total amount of time, this takes a little bit of work. I'll give you a head start. Pause the video. All right, let's see what you got. All right, so if I want the total, I'm adding up the value of every X. You're not just saying a fourth plus a third plus a half. No, that will not give you the answer for this problem. You can look at your table if they gave you a table, and you can add up from here. So you can add these, or use the line plot because they're grouped. So I see 2 of the fourths. 2. Oh, I started in a different place. So let's go to the halves. All right, so I see 5 of the halves. So if I add a half 5 times, a half plus a half plus a half plus a half plus a half, I get 5 halves. Okay, 5 halves is equal to 2.5. So just from these 5 times, he spent 2.5 hours playing Fortnite. All right, now let's look at whatever one I did next, the thirds. So if I look at my line plot, he spent a third of an hour playing Fortnite 3 times. So I need to add a third, and a third, which is 3/3 or a whole hour. And then now let's do the 2 fourths. I have a fourth and a fourth. Where are you? Come on. There we go. Nope, there we don't go. There we go. A fourth and a fourth is 2 fourths, which simplifies down to a half of an hour. So let's find the total. From the one row, we had 2.5 hours, and then we had 1 hour, and then we had another half hour. So if we add that together, 2.5 plus another half gives you 3, plus a whole gives you 4. So Juan spent a total of 4 hours playing Fortnite on Sunday. Is that true, Juan? All right, and our last question for this problem, what is the average amount of time in hours Juan spent playing Fortnite? So if we want to average all of his pieces of time together, okay, what is that average amount? So how do we do the average? You add up to get the total, which we've already done, and then you divide it by the number of pieces of data, which we already did. So actually numbers 1 and 2 help you to get the average or fair share. We just need both of those numbers in the right order because it's division. So it's the total divided by how many times. So the total was 4 divided by 10 times that he played. Where are you? There we go. 4 divided by 10 equals 4/10, which simplifies down to 2/5. So his average time was 2/5 of an hour, okay, between all of his interruptions. See you next time. Have a great rest of your day.